Welcome to SSI Meetup. Today we have with us Tim Bouma, Senior Analyst with Digital Identity, who works for the Government of Canada. And this is a pleasure to have Tim with us today. Some people call Tim also Mr. Identity Canada because he's so well known in the space and has been into the subject for a long time. Today we have with us also Drummond Reed, who will be joining the session interactively. And for any questions that will be coming up, as always, you will be able to ask them using this little tool to ask questions, and I'll be bringing up those questions to Tim. And if we go quickly to slide number 2, just going to share what SSI Meetup is about. The goal we have with SSI Meetup is to empower global SSI communities, and that really means that anyone around the world can use all the material that is being produced at SSI Meetup and create local communities, reuse the knowledge, and hopefully empower everyone to learn more about decentralized digital identities. This is open to everyone, to companies, to any person around the world, or to associations. If you're interested in joining, helping, or appearing in the SSI Meetup, please just reach out to me. And all the material we are sharing here is with a Creative Commons license by share alike. By share alike basically means it's an open source license that allows you to reuse this material. The Google slide deck is published on the blog, will be published on the blog post so that you can download it and reuse it. The only thing you will have to do is to share that this came from, in this case, from Tim Bouma, that he shared this presentation from SSI Meetup, and just reference back. And hopefully you can use this presentation and all the other presentations we have been doing so far. And if you have any questions during presentation, please just bring them up. And Tim, thank you very much for being with us here today. It's a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you, Alex. This is such a pleasure. I'm so excited to present and really appreciate you organizing this. I think there's a really exciting movement and community around self-sovereign identity, but also just a new way of doing things digitally. And I'm really excited to be a part of it and feel very honored to be able to contribute. So I'll just go to the next slide. I just want to set the context. I presume, Alex, you can see the slide 3. I'm under control and everything like that. So I'm good.
You're perfectly. Yeah.
Yeah. I think given that we have an international audience, I thought it would be worth just to spend a few moments just to talk about the Canadian context and the cultural change that's going within Canada. What I put up here is a set of what we've just recently published are the Government of Canada digital standards. And our new CIO, Alex Benet, who's been in the role for about, almost 2 years now, a year and a half or so, is really driving a cultural digital cultural change within the public service. He really wants us to embrace these principles. A lot of the stuff you've seen before in other contexts with other governments, I think everybody has to go through and develop them and internalize them, these type of principles. But really, it's a massive sea change for us. And really, what he wants us to do is to work in the open by default, design with users, iterate, improve. Like no longer are we to hide behind a veil and do stuff behind closed doors and present it as a fait accompli. Our goal is to change, to work out in the open. So you're starting to see more and more of our material out in GitHub and Google Docs. I would say that this SSI meetup is one of those things as well. And we're really trying to open ourselves up to actually get feedback, to learn, and actually to create the best thing that we can create for Canadians, as well as hopefully other parts of the world can use it as well. So really, I just wanted to show that to you. It's pretty straightforward. Really, I say the key thing is working open by default, use open standards, design ethical services, and we want to collaborate as widely as possible. So it's a change. We're still learning. It's not typical of government to be this way, but we're really trying to lead the charge with the CIO's office within the Government of Canada. So on to the next slide. I do have a consultation deck that's out there. On the title slide, you'll see links to a video that we put together, a consultation deck. We do have the beginnings of a GitHub repo. There's a few other more generalized presentations there that you can take a look at. but I just wanted to add a few slides just to help situate the presentation and what we're trying to do here with the Pan-Canadian Trust Framework and how this relates to digital identity. Just to give you a bit of background, I've been in this space of identity management, now we're calling it digital identity, for more than a decade. In my role as a senior analyst with the Government of Canada, I have been and still am actually one of the principal analysts that have written the Treasury Board policies for identity management. And for those of you just familiar with in the U.S., basically Treasury Board is very similar to the Office of the Management and Budget in the U.S. Our job is to provide administrative oversight, to provide direction to the rest of government, the departments and agencies, and to align all the initiatives that are going on. And the area that I've been focused on for more than a decade has been identity management. And I've been involved in all the different contexts, if you will, ranging from immigration, taxation, border control, passports, law enforcement, etc., around identity management. And really, at the end of the day, what we've had to do is try to synthesize those various contexts and the details into a set of fairly straightforward policy instruments so that we can actually not only align departments, but also challenge them in what they're doing to make sure that we are providing the best services for Canadians. And I just put this slide together just to give you a sense of what is the ultimate end game here. And really the end game, and it might feel like it's a bit oversimplified, it's really whether you're providing a service for tax or social or issuing a passport or you know any type of services. At the end of the day, what a program manager or a department needs to be confident of is, can they trust that digital identity? Can they trust that electronic representation of you? Is it actually you? Is it you on the other end of the line? Are you actually acting with your intent? This is really the centerpiece of what we're trying to do, is that we can trust the representation. Doesn't mean we're actually trusting the individual. That's a completely separate issue. That's really for the programs to decide in terms of that type of trust intent. This is really around trusting the electronic representation. Do you have the confidence that, yes, this individual is presenting themselves, and then from that you can actually carry out an interaction, a service, or a transaction? I know it might sound simple, but I really believe in actually trying to distill down the essence of the what. Going to the next slide, slide 5, is just another slide that I put together. What are the basics, or what's the essence of a trust framework? And you've heard this term, trust. Really, my view, trust is you're just relying on something over which you don't have direct control. I know there's lots of other definitions for trust, but you're relying on somebody else to carry something out on your behalf, or you're relying on a control which you can't directly observe. And if we take that prior diagram and I just build it out a little bit, it's really what you're trying to do is to trust a digital representation that you can actually use within as part of your service. You'll notice that digital is in parentheses there. Digital is the current term, but really at the end of the day, what's really important is the integrity of the processes. It could be digitally, it could be through voice, it could be in person or whatnot, but really what you're trying to do is to answer the question which I put on the bottom of the screen here. Within a given context, what do I need to hold true to rely on to do my business? I know it might sound a bit abstract, but it's actually a useful anchor to build out the trust framework. The other really important term that we've discovered is this notion of context. A digital representation only holds meaning within a particular context. The way we've described context with our policy instruments, it's typically for a given population. It could be a population of a province, it could be a population, a federal population. And the other aspect of a context is the legislation or the mandate that which you're operating under and carrying out your services or objectives. What I've discovered is that you can really distill the notion of context down to what are your goals, what are the rules, and what are the facts that you're relying on. And what I found very useful just recently before Christmas is that I discovered the whole language of Prologue, which is a declarative language which enables you to express something and to have confidence or actually evaluate if something is true or false. And the insight that I had with that, I won't go into that in too much detail. What a trust framework is, it's really a declarative framework. It's a framework that enables us to declare, not only for myself or on behalf of services, that I can actually rely on something and I have the evidence or I have the proofs to actually back that up. And in my view, that's the advice that we provide to our CIO and on behalf of other departments and agencies, that we have the right set of policy instruments, we have the right set of tools to evaluate so that we can actually provide that advice that, yes, you can accept or you can trust that digital identity. A few more slides. I pulled this from a more general presentation that we have, a workshop presentation that we've done. Digital identity in Canada. A few years back in, I think it was April of 2016, we worked with the provinces and territories and came up with a definition of a trusted digital identity. We've actually formalized the definition in our policy instruments, which will be approved very soon. Those are the Treasury Board policy instruments. A trusted digital identity, and I'll read it from the slide, is an electronic equivalent of who you are as a real person, used exclusively by you to receive valued services and to carry out transactions with trust and confidence. Yeah, it's a pretty loaded definition there, but the key thing here, it's a higher order definition. It's a higher order abstraction from login, username, proof of identity. It's an electronic equivalent of you interacting with a digital service. Why does it matter? Digital identity is the foundation to moving more services online, make them digital, and that's where our citizens expect it to be. We've discovered that, I call it the strategic speed bump. Like when you try to do digital transformation, put digital services online, you immediately run into the problem of who are you dealing with on the other end of the line. That is a fundamental problem that needs to be solved. It has to be solved with confidence, and I think we're well along that path within Canada. There's lots of work ahead, but I just wanted to give you a sense of that's the definition that we have within our policy instruments. Let me just go to the next slide. The other thing too, we're on slide 7, the trusted digital identity ecosystem. We've recognized, especially within Canada, we actually have to work across the public sector. And when I say the public sector, the different levels of government, federal, provincial, territorial, municipal governments. We also need to work across private sector and also sectors within private sector, banking, health, etc. So we actually have to come up with a system that can accommodate and work across all of those different needs, if you will, and actually provide a seamless experience for Canadians and how they access services. And again, this is one of the statements that we have, that the vision is to build a federated, it could be decentralized as well, but we use the term federated here, digital identity ecosystem where trusted digital identities are used to deliver Government of Canada services in a seamless manner on any platform with any partner on any device. What we're trying to do is set up a policy framework that does not constrain us to existing technology network providers, but also enables us to capitalize on the new and emerging technologies such as decentralized identity, self-sovereign identity, tokenized platforms, etc. So really to come up with a policy framework or requirements framework that enables the market to evolve and enables the market to compete, and it actually advances the industry. Government, we're a model customer, and we have to do things. We have to look at things in the very long term, and we have to make sure that not only what we put in place works well for Canadians, and I mean all Canadians, regardless of where they live in the country, regardless of their status, but we want to make sure that what we put in place or the demands that we put together can actually drive capability, industrial capability, economic capability. So we have to pay a special attention to make sure that what we need as government can actually bootstrap other ecosystems as well. Going on to slide 8, I pulled this out of a, yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, Tim, just I have a couple of questions accumulating
Sure.
here, so maybe we just bring them up. It's just Bo, he's saying in Finland, banks have provided EID service since the 90s, the same tool as for login into eBank, and he's saying it's being used by some 50 million times per year in the public sector, plus 80 million times in the private sector last year. And then he's asking, is this not in use in Canada? And it is a good way to get to self-sovereign now.
Yeah, okay. So I'll give you a bit of history. And again, I was involved with this back in 2007, 2008. We recognized that the government of Canada, we needed to improve our authentication services. And what we did was that we outsourced, we contracted out our authentication services, our login services, to a commercial broker service that in turn actually uses the banks. To give you an example of magnitude and scale, what the banks do in authentication transactions in a day, the government of Canada would do in a year. So there was an exponential difference there. We were quite happy to outsource authentication, i.e. the login aspect, username and password, etc. The part that we were not willing to outsource because it's just much more complex is the identity proofing, making sure it's a real person. So while we're quite happy, and what we did, we called that the separation of the identity from the credential. Recognizing that other countries have EID, the banks provide the proof of identity. Not so sure if that will work out in Canada because while the banks are basically use the AML KYC regulations, we've discovered that those requirements don't actually meet what we need for Government of Canada services. Further, those are more driven by compliance requirements, so the risk management model is different than what we need for services. The thing is that there are schemes in different countries and they work, and that's fine. Like one of the things that we've learned is very difficult to compare countries with one another. It's like comparing apples and oranges. We've actually had what we've called a very phased incremental approach within Canada. Very comfortable to outsource the authentication. And to give you a sense of the numbers, I believe we have, I think, what we call active credentials or active logins, different from authentication transactions. With the outsourced services, I believe we have about 13 to 14 million Canadians that are using the banks as well as the managed service provider. So I don't know if that answered the question. I think at the end of the day, we're quite happy to outsource or trust authentication or sign in, the identity proofing, the relying on the fact that you're a real person. We're just getting into that space as we speak, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. Did you have another question, Alex?
Yeah, I mean, there was one more comment from Bo, just to bring it up. He's saying also that teleoperators have moved in as well lately, and that often they use bank ID to sign up customers. And he's also mentioning that Finland has 5.5 million people, and is of course not alone. Other Nordics also in Estonia are playing with this too in parallel cards. So this is just his last comment.
Yeah, I just want to highlight the differences. Like some of the Nordic countries, as well as some of the continental European countries, are quite happy to have the banks as partners to provide the EID. As I said, every country is different. I would say a lot of countries have had identity programs for decades, if you will, and they basically just made that digital. It's a different story in Canada. A couple of situations is that again, we have different jurisdictions. Like we might look like one country on the map, but we're actually 14 jurisdictions with separate authorities, very very discrete levels of government. And the other thing too is, as I said, we're just moving very, very carefully. We've seen some false starts or resets in other countries. We're just moving very, very carefully in how we do this. It's really hard to just put legislation in place and expect it for Canadians to comply with it. We actually have to be very careful in how we move forward on this. Maybe we've been a little bit too conservative in how we've moved out, but I think one of the key things is that we've been actually very phased, very incremental. We had put together a paper, this is about 7-8 years ago. We called it as I said, the phased incremental approach. We're comfortable with the credentials or the logins to outsource that. Now we're getting into the identity, and we've actually have drafted up a public policy paper that we haven't made public yet, but we've actually had it reviewed by our deputy ministers, and you know, we're putting some lines in the sand for Canadians, if you will. Like we want to make sure that individuals' right to identity cannot be compromised. Privacy and security are absolutely critical in allowing Canadians to participate confidently in the digital society, and convenience and choice are key drivers for citizens. So we recognize that lots of commercial organizations do have some fabulous digital identity solutions. We just want to make sure that we put the conditions that are right for all Canadians, and let the market develop from there. So that's kind of a roundabout response to the question, but I'm hoping that does the job.
Sounds great.
Slide. Yep. So slide 8. This is one of the slides that we presented to our deputy ministers. The notion of a trusted digital identity, which we explained earlier. Really, we've conceptualized it as 3 components. And again, this slide is a little bit of a prior version. We're evolving some of the terminology here. Verified person. Is it a real person? Verified login. Is it the same person that you're dealing with as that real person? And then has the user actually given consent to provide their identity information, or given consent to actually participate in that interaction that you're doing, whether it's a service or whatnot. And then those 3 components, is it actually being conveyed through a trusted infrastructure, that security, privacy, user experience, communications, all that is actually preserved. And that's kind of where you'll see a little bit later on where the self-sovereign identity components fit in. Really, at the end of the day, what the trust framework is, which we'll get into a little bit later, it's really a set of criteria and specifications to ensure that all jurisdictions in the private sector abide by a common agreed upon set of rules to trust and accept each other's digital identities. On to drilling down into the Pan-Canadian Trust Framework. So we've been working on this, the notion of the trust framework, since late 2014 as a public sector, with the and we've taken a close look at you know, the EID regulations, I guess the IDSG stuff, Australia's framework, New Zealand, our own stuff, what the US has done with NIST, and really trying to synthesize that into something that makes sense for the Canadian context. And you'll see how that plays out a little bit later. But really, at the end of the day, you know, we want to have a very simple and integrative framework that's easy to understand, yet capable to be applied in a complex environment. When I say complex environment, one of the things that we've discovered is that we need to have a trust framework that operates across multiple contexts. When I say context, it could be a province, it could be a sector, an industry sector, and it could be a federal jurisdiction. We need something that can actually work across different contexts. One thing that we've discovered is that a lot of the guidance and a lot of the approaches out there only contemplate like a single context, either an enterprise or just a country. And what we've discovered is that we need something that works across different contexts. 2, technology agnostic. While, you know, technology, it's a double-edged sword. If you bake in too much technology-specific requirements into your framework, you paint yourself into a corner. We learned that lesson with the PKI going back 20 years, 15, 20 years. You know, the assumption was the public key infrastructure was going to solve the identity and authentication problem, and we put some PKI policies in place, and it didn't actually play out that way. And in fact, we had the I would say the opposite consequence, that we set the bar too high, that it prevented some departments and agencies from deploying some simpler technologies. So we pay a special attention to make sure that the requirements that we articulate or the objectives are technology agnostic. And this really plays into self-sovereign identity, blockchain, decentralized or distributed ledgers, how that fits in. Like, not so sure how that ecosystem will play out, how that technology will play out, but we know there is potential there, and we just want to make sure that we can accommodate those new technologies within this framework. The other thing, complement existing frameworks. Really what the trust framework is about is the integrity of business processes, and that we can rely on what we call trusted processes. We don't need to repeat what's already done in security assessment methodologies or privacy impact assessments, service delivery, etc. We want to have something that is just another tool in the toolbox that can be used in addition to that. So we just don't want to repeat good work that's already done, like privacy by design, for example. And we want to add something new. And really what it is about the integrity of those business processes that enable a trusted digital identity. Fourth is, I talked about being independent of technology. We have to be somewhat independent of legislation as well, because as I talked about earlier, Canada is really 14 different jurisdictions, and clear division of powers, but we want to have a clear set of rules that can actually be assessed, but actually mapped to either legislation or policy or regulation within the different contexts. So our Treasury Board policy instruments map to it very well. We have the notion of trusted digital identity. We have the notion of trust frameworks that are approved by the CIO. Our high-level requirements and our directive map to the high-level components of the trust framework. And we have the tools that we need to put it in force within the federal jurisdiction. How the provinces and territories will do it will be up to them, but we have a clear way of enforcing or enacting it within the federal programs and services. And fifth is really trying to normalize and standardize key processes and capabilities to enable cross-sector collaboration and ecosystem development. Bit of a mouthful there. But what we discovered was that when you started to look at all the really good guidance and standards that were out there, it's really hard to map them to one another. We've done some mapping exercises with the US and the UK. We've mapped, we've done some stuff with the Digital 9 countries. It's really hard to map it because everybody looks at the problem a little bit differently. To give you an example, the approach that we took in Canada is that we made a statement that we're trying to look beyond the documents. It's about the information or the claims on the document, and what's really important is not the document itself, but it's really the processes, the issuance processes, the vetting processes that created the authoritative record, whether that's in a vital statistics database or in another database, and the document is just the conveyance mechanism that's presented. And that's the approach that we've taken. Our requirements are articulated in that sense. And so, for example, the Treasury Board requirements, we don't talk about specific documents. We actually have criteria for departments for creating their own acceptability criteria for documents. Whereas we've seen in other standards, they talk about driver's licenses, passports, etc. that's okay, but the thing is that what's important is the information and the processes that are underneath those documents. It's not the form of the document itself. So we really took that thinking over into the trust framework. And again, you know, bringing this to self-sovereign identity, it's really about digital proofs and how do you verify digital proofs, and independent of embodiment and independent of form. And I found that has given us a real advantage on thinking about the problem. Slide 10. When we started to develop and test this out, we've been doing alpha testing and assessment. We've actually completed one with a province. It's ready to go. We're just waiting for the official go-ahead with the announcements, the final signatures by the to approve it. But we have a province ready and waiting to go that we're accepting their trusted digital identity to enable people to access federal services. We discovered that we needed, in addition to trusted digital identity, we needed some higher level representations, and we call that, or we're calling those trusted digital representations. You'll see that on the next slide. We've also identified 24 atomic trusted processes. Another thing that we discovered with the guidance, everybody names things slightly differently: program enrollment, program registration, service registration, identity registration, all kind of doing the same thing, but a little bit differently. And we decompose those business processes, and we've defined 24 atomic trusted processes, which I'll go in a little bit later. What we discovered when we did that, we could actually mix and match these atomic trusted processes and group them together to form what we're calling compound trusted processes, such as identity assurance, credential assurance, notification, and consent. And we discovered that those higher level trusted processes, or compound trusted processes, are fairly fluid in their definition, and that's okay, but I think we've nailed down the atomic trusted processes that will allow some flexibility there. We haven't thought of everything. We've designed this that it's extensible and interoperable. We can add on additional trusted processes as required. And we're also looking to map the trusted processes to vectors of trust. Everybody is familiar with levels of assurance. There's advantages and disadvantages. We're looking at ways of introducing additional qualifiers, and I like the term that the EID or the European Union uses, like qualifiers, and that might be something that we may explore as well. Slide 11.
Tim, just one question before we move forward.
Yeah.
Coming from David, and he's asking, like, in respect to Canada and the Pan-Canadian Trust Framework, the question is, who would ultimately own and control the digital identity of a user in terms of what the ID can do, and any sanction upon it, etc. So authorization versus the authentication, the two being different.
Yeah. Okay. Governance is still an issue on this. Like, I would say what we're trying to do is really be clear on the nuts and bolts and define what actually needs to be governed. What we're doing federally, what we're putting in place, we're charting new waters here. So we'll see how this plays out. We've put together a public policy paper. From a federal point of view, we are doing an assessment with the provinces and the territories using the trust framework and against our policy instruments, and we're issuing what we call a letter of acceptance to the jurisdiction, saying, we have assessed your processes, we're comfortable with them, we've made some observations, we are willing to accept your trusted digital identity from a province, and we will use it to provide services to Canadians. And if we find any issues with it, we can revoke it or not, or have that discussion. So we're doing it one by one. In terms of an overall governance, that remains to be seen how that will play out. There's really two aspects of the governance: is the framework itself, the rule set itself, how that evolves, and who actually governs the deliverables, if you will. Then the other part is how those deliverables are applied. And yeah, the interesting thing about digital identity or identity is that it cuts across the sectors and jurisdictions, and really we have to learn as we go. The way that we're doing it federally is we're working with the provinces to say, hey, you can provide us with a digital identity. We want to hold the jurisdiction as a whole accountable for the integrity of that program, and it's for them to decide how to make those arrangements within the jurisdiction. We really can't step in to say this is how you should do it or which vendors you should use. We have a set of criteria that we expect you or expect all of us to abide by and provide evidence to the effect that you're meeting that, and we'll sign, as I said, a letter of acceptance. It's really, you know, the thing about trust is that you can't mandate trust. It's basically, it's something that you have to rely on. So it's really, it's a peer counterparty kind of thing, and we're just feeling our way on how to roll this out. Like, as I said, how we're doing it federally is that we're working with the provinces and territories really to make them provide us with a digital identity, and in turn, if we do this right, they can provide it between the jurisdictions. I don't think we're there yet about accepting a trusted digital identity for public services from the financial institutions yet. That's something that we're looking at, but you know, we're just kind of figuring this out as we go along. I don't know if that answers the question, but we're getting into some terra nova, some new territory here that we need to sort out. We're being very careful in how we do this.
Thank you.
Slide 12. These are the 3 top-level trusted digital representations that we've defined so far. When I say a trusted digital representation, it basically maps to some sort of entity or legal entity out in the real world that has rights, duties, obligations, and intent. And that's for the legal frameworks to sort out. We want to have like a clear mapping to that person, that organization. Also, the other trusted representation is a verified relationship. What I mean by a verified relationship, it could be an officer of a company, a guardian of another individual, you know, parents, etc. We're not there yet. I have been focusing on myself just getting the trusted digital identity piece sorted out. We have our colleagues over at Innovation, Science, and Economic Development working on the organizational aspect, and there's some work that's just starting up on the verified relationship. But really, the thing to take away here is that the trust framework, what it's trying to do is map the intent of the actors, the rights of the actors, and map it to the enabling technical ecosystems. That's my first attempt at describing it, but really it's really, you need to map this to a technical underpinning, and the trust framework is the glue there. Slide 13. This is the essence of the trust framework, the trusted process model. It's really a very simple state transition model, and I'll just read the definition here. A trusted process is an activity or set of activities that results in a state transition in an object that can be relied on by other trusted processes. It's like a chain of proofs. It's a chain of integrity. The idea here is that something goes in, namely evidence. There's some process that is carried out, and you'll see some examples on the next slide. And there's an output that can be relied on, which then might be relied on by downstream processes. What we try to do is define these independent of organization, independent of higher level business processes, because as I talked about earlier, there's lots of ways of rendering this in business processes. And really, this is the essence of the trust framework, is really formalizing and standardizing these trusted processes, the input states, the output states, and the conformance criteria, because that's what you have to trust. I know it sounds very mathy and very abstract, but we've been like trying to figure this out for the past few years, and this has been the most useful model, because what we discovered is that different jurisdictions, different organizations organize themselves differently. Different ministries or different agencies of government carry out processes in different parts of government in different jurisdictions, and we just needed a way to model it independent of who actually carries that out. That's the next part of the discussion. The next slide, slide 14, just shows you some examples of atomic trusted processes. They might sound pretty self-evident, but you know, that's the point here. Like, for example, identity validation. That's the confirmation of accuracy of information. You give me information about yourself, I need to confirm it against an authoritative record. So I'm basically taking self-asserted information, carrying out a process, and then I get confirmed identity information. Credential authentication. You have an issued credential, username with a password or whatnot. It gets authenticated, it becomes an authenticated credential. You have a one-time consent, you provide a consent for one time, but then you want to be able to persist it, and you want to turn that into an ongoing consent. So that gives you an idea of the state transitions here. On to the next slide. We've identified 24 Lego bricks, if you will, and these are the ones that we're formally defining of the atomic trusted processes. And I'll go through them in detail a little bit later on. The thing that we've discovered is, as I said earlier, those 24 Lego blocks on slide 15, as I said, we have terms like identity confirmation, service registration, etc. And we've discovered that we can actually break those down into those atomic trusted processes and the state transitions. So it's just an example of a term that we were using, identity confirmation. We could break it down into, well, what you're really doing is identity validation. Identity maintenance, you're making sure you have the up-to-date information. Identity verification, we've defined as making sure an individual is claiming their own information, not someone else's. And then actually the slide is a bit out of date. The liveness and fraud detection, we're calling that identity presentation now. So yeah, just slide 17 just shows some other compound trusted processes. And we've tested this out in the work that we've done with the federal and provincial programs, just seeing how these map, or how some of their business processes decompose into those atomic trusted processes. Slide 18, and I'll just go through this part very quickly. Identity assurance, we've identified 8 trusted processes. Identity resolution, uniquely resolving the unique identity information within a population. Identity establishment is the creation of the authoritative record. Identity validation is confirming it. Identity verification is making sure it's the individual claiming that information. Identity maintenance is making sure it's current. Identity presentation, this is the one that we've been working with, is making sure that that individual is actually really there and is actually present during that transaction. And the other two, identity credential binding, is really tying an identity or identity information to a credential or authenticator. And then identity linking is the one that took us a while to figure out, is actually associating different identifiers within different contexts to each other. And when I talk about the different contexts, the example that I give is that with a province, for example, they assign what they call a UFID, a unique federated ID. And then in the federal program, we actually have to map that to another identifier, which is the social insurance number. And that's called identity linking. Credential assurance, that's the compound process. I won't go through them all. That's basically, if you're familiar with the NIST SB 863B, that's the authentication lifecycle management. The notification and consent is really asking for consent. And again, this is still a work in progress here. At the higher level compound trusted processes, we're still looking at the atomic processes if we need to change. But coming back to slide 21 is really what we want to be able to do, is that if we're going to trust this digital identity, we need to have confidence in the identity assurance, credential assurance, and the notification and consent, and that it's being delivered through a trusted supporting infrastructure. So I know that's a lot, but on slide 22, we now have the ability to conceptualize in a more detailed, a more rigorous way what a trusted digital identity is. It can be conceptualized as a set of trusted process outputs that are independent of a conveyance method. And when I say conveyance method, it could be a SAML assertion, it could be a database lookup, it could be OpenID Connect, it could be a verifiable credential, it could be a zero knowledge proof, it could be, it takes those conveyance methods out of the equation. And the other thing that it takes out of the equation is that depending on the ecosystem, some of these trusted processes may be carried out by multiple parties at different points in time. I'll give you an example. With the province that we're dealing with, they have a single program that does all the credential management, the identity proofing, the notification and consent. They do all of that within their program. But other jurisdictions might say, just as what we've done in the federal government, is that the authentication piece, the credential assurance piece, we're just going to outsource to private sector companies, but you're still accountable for those processes. So it just gives flexibility for jurisdictions or anybody that's in the role of a trusted digital identity provider to set up the arrangements that they want. But at the end of the day, what we're looking for is that these trusted processes are meeting the conformance criteria that we've set out, that we can rely on them. Slide 23 gives a good example of where we laid out the 24 processes with the levels of assurance, and then the trusted digital identity provider, what they had to carry out and what we assessed. And you'll see the identity linking is missing here because they don't do that. And then what a credential service provider is providing. In this example here, they're not providing nothing, not providing anything because we didn't scope them in the analysis. But what we discovered, a relying party like a service provider, a federal service, while they may be relying on a trusted digital identity provider, they may be doing some of the trusted processes again for their own context. So the example that I give is that we know from a province, they have uniquely identified the individual within that population. That's great. And they're providing the trusted digital identity of John Smith that's coming across the wire. But then the relying party, they still have the job of mapping that John Smith to the client that they have on file, the social insurance number, for example. So this was one of the insights that we had when we did the alpha testing, was that, and this is where a lot of confusion is that while the trusted digital identity provider may be providing, carrying out these trusted processes, the relying party may have to do those same processes again within their context to make sure that it maps to the right person that they have on file. And similarly, when you get into the notice and consent, the trusted digital identity provider is doing it all around making sure that that individual is willing to provide that identity information. But then the federal program may be asking additional information or additional consent for the particular context within which they're operating. So that was one of the key insights that we had, was that while these trusted processes are carried out within a context, they may, the downstream context, they may be carried out again. It may not necessarily be subject to the trust framework, but they are accountable within their own program. Again, this slide here is just showing the assessment process. Did the colors come out here? Anything that's shaded is the trusted digital identity provider. This is what we assessed from the province, these trusted processes and conformance criteria, what we provided in scope for the assessment process. The next slide shows a relying party if they're not using a trusted digital identity provider. And again, you have to do all these things. Like, you have to do everything. And if you are a relying party using a trusted digital identity, on the next slide, this is where the business case is realized, is that there's a whole bunch of processes that you don't have to do. And there's a real business case to be made there, that if you actually have a federal program, for example, that can rely on a trusted digital identity coming from a province, it really streamlines things and enables us to actually basically outsource a lot of those processes and not have to do them internally. I'm just mindful of the time here. I talked about earlier scoping out the other pieces that are related to the trust framework, the trusted supporting infrastructure. These things are absolutely important, but not the essence of the trust framework. For example, the specific standards and specifications like SAML, OpenID Connect, etc. Privacy impact assessment, security assessment authorization, audit and logging, absolutely important. And what we discovered when we did our pilot project, all of these tools and assessment processes were in place with other tools, and the trust framework was just an additional tool that was used to ensure the confidence in the business processes. Here's a slide. This is one of the key insights that we had on slide 28. When you start conceptualizing trusted processes, or a digital identity as trusted process outputs, it becomes very clear that we don't need to specifically worry about the conveyance methods, and the proofs, or those assertions, whatever you want to call them, can be conveyed with traditional centralized federated models or decentralized models like distributed ledger, blockchain, etc. And really, this has been very helpful for us to really help us understand and situate that the various network providers can provide that capability in the middle in terms of conveying those proofs through digital wallets and verifiable credentials or tokenized proofs or SAML assertions or whatnot. But the real essence of the trust framework is making sure what goes into the system and what comes out can be trusted. A good analogy that I give is drinking water. Like, it's our responsibility to make sure that the drinking water is clean, is acceptable going into the pipes, and it's really the responsibility of the people providing the pipes and the plumbing to make sure that that water doesn't get contaminated along the way. So, you know, if the water's not good to begin with, you have a public health problem. If the water is contaminated along the line, you have a plumbing problem. It's just a nice way of understanding or segmenting the responsibilities and the accountabilities. I just took these slides from Drummond's presentation here. Like what's really emerging as a powerful pattern is this way of conveying digital proofs, and you can be issued a digital proof, it can be held in your wallet, and you can present it to a relying party, and it can be independently verified via decentralized identifiers that are registered on a blockchain or decentralized network. And once you internalize that model, you realize that there's a very powerful model that equips individuals to actually hold and present their digital proofs without having to phone home to an authority each time to actually verify that those proofs are legitimate or not. So we're pretty excited about this new ecosystem capability coming about, and how that can play into and enable the trust framework. How this fits together, this is a work in progress, and Drummond, if you're on the line, feel free to chip in. Like, I view the Pan-Canadian Trust Framework is really they're bookends to a more technical trust framework, which is more concerned about ensuring that the infrastructure and everything is conveyed. But our primary concern with the Pan-Canadian Trust Framework is making sure that those business processes that are developing those proofs or those trusted digital identities are good to begin with. They can be put into like an infrastructure. We know that they're conveyed properly, and out the other side, then the relying parties could rely on those proofs via the via the Pan-Canadian Trust Framework. So I think it's still a work in progress. I think, my view, and correct me if I'm wrong, Drummond, really, for example, the Sovereign Trust Framework is really concerned about making sure that the sovereign network is actually operating. You've got good nodes, it's up and running, it's highly available, etc. And what goes in the system is actually following the right rules, and that's something that we can avail ourselves to use, and it would be used in conjunction with the Pan-Canadian Trust Framework. I view the issues of conveying the proofs, the digital wallets, all that network stuff is really the domain of the private sector to solve, and really what the public sector, our focus is to make sure that we got a real person. We are sure that what they're using digitally is under the control. We have the proper consent so that we can enable our relying parties to go about their business and what they do. Slide 31, just vectors of trust. We're exploring the idea of using vectors of trust in addition to or instead of levels of assurance. We're exploring that. This is just an entity relationship diagram, slide 32. Again, we've done some pretty detailed modeling, rigorous modeling of persons, relationships, and organizations. This is just an entity relationship diagram. And then the final slide, I've been invited to write a chapter on trust and identity with the Decentralized Digital Identity book that Alex and company are working on. So I'll leave it at that and hand it over to Alex and Drummond for any questions or discussion.
Yeah, I think we have a couple of comments here. Let me just pick them up the moment. Meanwhile, Drummond, do you want to come up with the questions you have in mind?
Sure. Actually, Tim, this is fantastic. You've covered a lot of territory in a short period. If you back up 2 slides to the one where you were showing one more, to that one. I was going to ask you a question, then you basically answered it, which was, as we have been creating the sovereign governance framework, you're right, it is about that, basically doing that foundation, the part that's in blue. And I was going to ask you, but you pretty much answered that the Pan-Canadian Trust Framework is, I think, a stellar example of the kind of thing that we, in this diagram, you see as a governance framework for your domain, right? Although all of Canada is a very large domain. Mm-hmm. But it does seem like there's a great fit, certainly one that I want to explore in a lot more detail. So let me turn it into a question, which is, as you've been developing this for the past 4 or 5 years, and you've seen self-sovereign identity emerge in this whole architecture, what is your feeling? What is the biggest impact you think SSI will have in the direction and use of the Pan-Canadian Trust Framework?
Well, I am hoping, the biggest challenge with digital identity is adoption, and I think it's not cause and effect. It's more like a symbiosis. So I think with a self-sovereign identity, the light bulb went on for me late last year. I was at an aviation security workshop, and all they were talking about was basically how do we share more information and how do we know more about the individual that's going across borders. And I kind of went, no, it's not about sharing information. It's about equipping individuals to have digital proofs, and ideally to have zero knowledge proofs. And a great example, you may be aware that we've recently legalized cannabis in Canada. Actually, they legalized it on my birthday. I don't know if it's a coincidence or not. But now we have an issue that if people have purchased cannabis or whatnot, they're worried about their, when they have to present their identity, proof that they're legal to buy, that information is going to end up in the hands of, other enforcement agencies outside a country, and you start thinking about that problem. You say, well, just imagine if you can actually create a digital proof that says, you don't need to know who I am because I'm going to pay in cash. or I'm going to pay electronically. You just need to know that I'm legal to buy cannabis at this point in time, and that's all you need to know. And then I realized that the whole information sharing paradigm that we've been sort of acclimatized to, we can totally move away from that and equip individuals to have their digital proofs or verifiable credentials so that they can present it in a way that they want. And then once you got that new mental model in your mind, then you say, well, let's start thinking about the authorities. Who would actually vouch for that? Yeah, likely the province or the federal government. And the other thing that it does, it actually it takes those authorities out of the center of the interaction. Like, you don't need them in the center. They just get pushed out in the edge. They just provide those proofs, they give them to you, and you use them, and you don't need to phone home again. So I think in conjunction with trying to formalize what we're trying to do with the Pan-Canadian Trust Framework, just focusing on business process integrity, conceptualizing digital identity as a collection of claims that you can present, and then putting that in action with self-sovereign identity. Man, oh man, this is just a completely new model, and it just changes the game in my view. And we're already starting to talk about you know, how this could impact like AML KYC. Well, you could actually have the digital proofs provisioned to your phone or whatever device, and then we know from a government and regulatory standpoint that, you know, we know that proof is good, we know it's the right holder, we know it's presented properly, and it meets all the regulatory requirements, and we can get a cryptographic proof of that, and we're done. So I just think it's more of a, as I said, not cause and effect. It's a symbiosis of the frameworks that I think is really going to enable the adoption or the trust of Canadians to use this.
That's a fantastic answer. I love it. So I know we're running short on time, so I'll turn it back over to Alex for other questions that have been posed.
Yeah, I have a question here from Antti. He's asking, how did the private sector react to this? How deeply have they been involved in creating the Pan-Canadian Trust Framework?
Yeah, we've been working with DIAC, the Digital Identification Authentication Council of Canada. It is a collaborative effort that we're working on with the trust framework. You know, I think not only the private sector, but also the public sector too is really, you know, we're changing some of the thinking here, and you know, we're socializing it. Not saying it's correct or it's the way or whatnot. You know, the way I've described it internally is that this is not about technology. It's about creating a new institution, a digital institution, and redefining how we think, how we do things. I think we've been pretty successful within the federal government to have everybody to start think not about their specific program, but more of an enterprise. And you know, one of the narratives that's really taking hold is that we are making it clear to our programs is that you don't need to do identity. You can just be a relying party, and the relying party can be the province, the territory, it could be it could be other sectors. So there's a lot of rethinking, reframing the problem that are reframing the issues, and we are grappling with that. Like, we've put together a public policy paper to help solidify our position collectively with the public sector, working with the private sector. My view, and this is just him speaking, is that we're doing a wholesale reconceptualization of the problem. And I would say, I would give credit to SSI and the thinking. It's really enabled us, or enabled me, to think about the problem in a completely different way. I think about it differently than I did even a year or year and a half ago.
Amazing. We have a question here from Vikas. He's asking, is there a way we could get access to the code base, documentation, run locally, learn and contribute?
Yeah, absolutely. What I did on the front of this presentation, I actually put the links to the consultation deck and got the beginnings of a GitHub repo there. It's mainly just documentation for now. I'm also going through a mapping exercise where I'm going through all the existing guidance like NIST, GPG 45, the UK stuff, our own stuff, probably I'll do Australia, New Zealand as well, mapping it to the trusted processes to make sure that the model holds and makes any adjustments. So as I said, we're trying to make this stuff open as possible. Alex, I think you're publishing this deck or making it available after this presentation. Yeah, so there'll be links there. I'm very active on Twitter. What I try to do is pretty much put my thoughts out on Twitter and point to the material. So that's a good way of getting up to date. And yeah, feel free to reach out to me. Like honestly, the best method is to have the conversation in comments in the consultation deck that we have in Google Docs. There's been a bunch of comments coming in. I'm reflecting on them, replying on them. Our analysts were looking at them and saying, how is this going to affect what we're writing up or the next version of it? And that's a good way of participating and keeping in touch. I'm a Twitter addict, so that, honestly, that I would say that's the best way is just see what I'm up to on Twitter, and I try to push out as much as I can there.
Yeah, absolutely. We will be publishing the presentation as soon as possible, so it will be available at a blog post where we have published this webinar for people to get registered. And I have one more question coming here from DM, and DM is asking, what level of alignment is there between your framework and the secure key verified.me product that is supposed to be coming out very soon?
Yeah, so the way I look at what Secure Key is doing, what Sovereign is doing, those are basically, I know Interac is doing stuff in the space as well, Visa, MasterCard. They are basically network providers. We know that, or the digital rails, if you will, like the payment systems are looking to put identity on their digital rails. There's some, or their payment rails. We know that there's some brand new decentralized networks like Sovereign that are coming out. Verified Me is one of those as well. So really, that's how I look at it. There's some other pieces too, which I'm hoping the industry really sorts out for everyone to use. That's really digital wallet standards, key recovery standards, application standards, and certifications, so that, you know, when something goes on a person's phone, they can actually trust the darn thing and present the claims in a way that can be accepted. Like the scenario that I see is that, you know, we work with the provinces and territories. We work hard on making sure that we know that these are real people, that they are the actual holder of the wallet, and then they can actually present their proofs for whatever services that are necessary. And again, this is just Tim speaking. There's once we get the digital identity proofs in a digital wallet or something like that, it's pretty straightforward to extend it to like driver's license, vaccination records, academic degrees and whatnot. And as I said, like the model, that digital proof model, really just it removes a big friction that we have in the economy. And we're starting to see some really cool stuff. Like we're doing some pilot projects with Learning Machine on academic credentials, and presenting academic credentials or work credentials. You know, it all falls into that same model. So I don't know if I answered the question here, but oh yeah, coming back to verified me, like there's the key thing. What we want to do with the trust framework is enable innovation, also to be standards based, and to make sure that we as governments are not locked into anything proprietary. We can actually switch by virtue of the standards and really give the best value and flexibility and inclusiveness for Canadians.
Great. I think we're kind of running out of time. There are two more small comments from Bo, but I'll be conveying them to you, where he's commenting a little bit about the Nordic situation. If you go back to the next to the book slide, I just wanted to highlight quickly that Tim will be one of the co-authors of the book that we're preparing, with many other decentralized digital identity leaders or self-sovereign identity thinkers around the world, which will be published later this year. And Tim's chapter is the meaning of trust and identity. The title might still change, but there's a very rough website right now that you can check out, which is identitybook.info, where you can sign up with your email to get updates in the future, or you can follow also Identity Book HQ on Twitter. And if you go to the last slide, you have the contact details for Tim. This is the Canadian month, so we're just starting this out with Tim, but we will have Mike Brown from ATB, a bank in Alberta, joining us later this month. 2 days later, we will have John Jordan from the government of British Columbia, and I'm still trying to get Daryl O'Donnell. And I think if we get all these gentlemen in the next 3-4 weeks, we will have a good overview of the Canadian SSI digital identity ecosystem. And Tim, this was very, very good. It was a pleasure to have you with us here today. Do you have any final thoughts you would like to share?
Thank you for the opportunity. I'm really excited for what 2019, what this year will bring. Like, I feel like we've broken the back conceptually in what we need to do for trusted digital identity, and really looking forward to the next year.
Excellent. So for anyone, if you want to be kept updated about the upcoming webinars, just go to ssimeetup.org. You can sign up to the newsletter, especially go to Twitter. We are very active on Twitter, sharing stuff that is coming up. And this is a big thing. I think this will be the year of self-sovereign identity, and it will be a big thing, I'm sure, for 2020. So keep on learning, and we will keep on sharing material, especially be active in your own community, start learning, start pushing this. I think there will be a lot of good things happening there. Thank you, Drummond, for being with us today too. And it was great having you all with us.
Thank you, Alex.
It
was
night.
Fantastic to hear, Tim. You're back. Bye-bye all.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Okay, bye.